I'm an ER doctor, and after 20 years I've seen almost everything a human body can endure. Gunshot wounds with blood flooding the floor before I could even pull on gloves. Car wreck victims pulled from twisted steel with bones broken in ways nature never intended. Overdoses, strokes, infants gasping their first breaths, and the elderly struggling with their last. You'd think with enough time in this place nothing could surprise me. But one night, in the middle of a shift like any other, I met a patient whose story still follows me. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I couldn't explain. The night had started the way most do in the emergency room. Chaos wrapped in routine. The fluorescent lights hummed above us with that faint, unnatural buzz that never goes away no matter how long you work beneath them. Monitors beeped in overlapping rhythms, each machine sounding off like an instrument in an orchestra no one wanted to hear. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee clung to the air, thick and almost metallic. Outside it was raining. I remember that because each time the ambulance bay doors opened, a damp chill rolled in, and for a moment the scent of wet asphalt cut through the bleach and sweat. Around midnight, I was halfway through suturing a young man's forehead, just a bar fight, nothing unusual, when the paramedics wheeled in a middle-aged man on a stretcher. He was conscious, though pale and clutching his chest. They called out the basics as they rolled him past the triage desk. Mid-40s, sudden onset of chest pain at home, no history of heart disease, stable vitals en route. I handed off the suture tray to a resident and went straight to the new arrival. The patient's name was Thomas. Early 50s maybe, though stress had aged him. His shirt was damp with rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He had a wiry frame, the kind of man who probably worked with his hands. There was something in his eyes though, a flicker of fear that went beyond pain. I've seen enough heart attacks to recognize the look of someone who knows their body is betraying them, but this was different. Like he was afraid of something I couldn't see. "Sir, I'm Dr. Reynolds," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder as the nurses transferred him to the bed. "Tell me what you're feeling." His breathing was shallow, but his words were clear. "It's pressure. Not sharp, just heavy, like someone sitting on my chest." Classic description. Too classic. We started the usual protocol: EKG, oxygen, blood work, chest x-ray. I asked about his medical history. He shook his head. No prior issues, no family history of cardiac disease. He wasn't on any medication. He didn't smoke, didn't drink heavily, and by all accounts he was healthy, but as I looked at him, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The first EKG came back normal. Completely normal. I checked the leads myself, making sure nothing was misplaced. Still normal. His oxygen saturation was 98%, his blood pressure a little elevated but not alarming. We drew blood to check his troponins, markers for heart muscle damage, and sent it to the lab. While we waited, I stayed by his side. Something about his stillness unsettled me. Patients in pain usually shift, fidget, try to find a position that offers some relief, but Thomas lay perfectly still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as though listening for something. "Does it hurt more when you move?" I asked. He shook his head faintly. "No, it's not that kind of pain. It's different. I don't know how to say it. Feels like something's wrong inside, but not where you'd expect." It wasn't the words, but the way he said them, as if he knew exactly what was wrong but couldn't put it into human language. The chest x-ray returned. Clear. No fluid in the lungs, no widened mediastinum, no signs of trauma. Every image was perfect, too perfect. By then the rain outside had intensified. I remember the sound of it hitting the ambulance bay doors, steady and relentless, like a second pulse under the noise of the ER. A nurse handed me the lab results. Normal. No elevation of cardiac enzymes, nothing to indicate a heart attack. I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. I told myself it was good news, everything normal meant he'd be fine. But deep down, I didn't believe it. As the hours passed, Thomas remained stable. Vitals in range, pain persistent but not worsening, no new symptoms. We admitted him for observation, thinking maybe unstable angina, maybe something subtle brewing that hadn't declared itself yet. Medicine is often about waiting and watching, and I tried to reassure myself that's all this was. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. Just before the nurses wheeled him upstairs, Thomas turned his head toward me. His lips were pale, his eyes glassy, but his voice was steady when he whispered, "You won't find it." For a moment, I didn't know if I'd imagined it. I leaned closer. "Find what?" He swallowed hard, as if the effort itself cost him. "What's wrong with me? You won't find it." I froze. In all my years I'd heard patients confess fears, beg for help, pray out loud, but I had never heard someone say that, not like that. It wasn't desperation, it was certainty. Then they wheeled him away and I stood there with the rain drumming outside, wondering why I felt colder than I should have. The floor upstairs was quieter than the storm outside, but only just. The rain had turned into a full downpour, hammering against the narrow hospital windows. I joined the team to check on Thomas again once he was settled into a monitored bed. The heart monitor traced out neat, steady waves, green lines on black, perfect. His oxygen held steady, his blood pressure normalized. By every metric he was fine, but sitting there beside him I could see he was not. He hadn't moved from when I'd last seen him. His breathing was shallow but even, his gaze still locked on the ceiling tiles. I asked again about his pain, and he only repeated that same phrase. "It's heavy." He didn't flinch, didn't grimace. He spoke like a man describing the weather, resigned, almost detached. We repeated the EKG. Normal again. We ordered a CT scan of the chest, looking for pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs. It's a silent killer, one I've missed before, one that hides until it's too late. But the scan came back clear, every vessel, every airway pristine. By then the nurses had grown uneasy too. They whispered about how strange it was, how patients don't usually hold themselves so still unless they're gravely ill, and yet the machines betrayed nothing. I felt it too, that clash between the visible man before me and the invisible numbers that told a different story. I pulled up a chair and sat at his bedside longer than protocol required. Sometimes that's the only way you can sense what's coming, not through machines, not through lab results, but through the quiet presence of a body that knows its own limits better than medicine does. "Thomas," I said softly, "everything we've checked so far looks good. That's a good sign, but I can tell you're still worried. Tell me, what does it feel like, really?" For the first time he shifted his gaze to meet mine. His eyes were dark and clear, and the way he looked at me unsettled me more than anything else that night. "It feels," he said slowly, "like something is waiting." "Waiting," I repeated. He nodded faintly. "Not in my chest, not in my heart, just close, like it's already decided." I didn't know what to say to that. I could have told him that medicine doesn't work on premonition, that bodies fail for reasons we can test and measure. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing something he felt in a place I couldn't reach. The night wore on. Every test we ordered returned unremarkable. Blood work, imaging, serial enzymes, nothing. The monitors ticked on faithfully, reassuring anyone who trusted machines more than human eyes. The residents rotated in and out, checking on him, documenting their findings, each one leaving with a furrowed brow. Around 3 in the morning I walked past his room again. I wasn't assigned to him at that hour. Technically another physician had taken over the floor, but I couldn't stay away. Something kept drawing me back. The room was dim. Just the soft glow of the monitor, the faint hum of oxygen through the nasal cannula, and the rain tapping like fingers on the window pane. Thomas's wife sat by his bed now. I hadn't met her earlier, but the exhaustion in her posture told me she'd been carrying his fear long before tonight. She was in her 40s, hair pulled back hastily, still wearing a soaked cardigan she hadn't bothered to remove. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap as though holding herself together by force. I introduced myself quietly, and she managed a small nod. "He doesn't look right," she whispered. "He says he's fine, but I know him. He doesn't look right." I glanced at the monitor, still steady. "We're keeping a close watch," I reassured her. "Everything we've done so far hasn't shown anything dangerous, but I believe you. You know him better than anyone." She looked at me with eyes rimmed red from tears. "He said something to me before the ambulance came. He said he could hear something, like a clock." A chill ran up my spine. "A clock, yes. He told me it was ticking closer." She looked down at him, her lips trembling, but there was no sound in the room. I wanted to dismiss it as fear talking, as a man's strange way of explaining the pressure in his chest. But I couldn't shake the symmetry of it. Her story and his earlier words about something waiting. It was as though they both knew, on some level, that the night already had a conclusion written, and we were just pretending we could delay it. At 4 his labs were drawn again. Normal. At 5 another EKG, flawless. I began to feel mocked by the very tools that had always been my shield against uncertainty. It was as though the machines had conspired to protect me from the truth, keeping me in the dark while something else crept closer. Around 6 I stopped in once more. Thomas was still awake, though his face looked paler in the first dim blue of morning creeping through the window. His wife had dozed off in the chair beside him. He noticed me standing in the doorway and whispered, "It's almost here." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "What is?" His eyes didn't leave the ceiling. "You won't see it, but it's already here." There are moments in this job when you feel the world narrow to just 2 people. You and the patient, nothing else. That was one of those moments. The storm outside was quieting, the monitors steady, the air thick with antiseptic, but all I could hear were those words, and then, as if nothing had been said, he closed his eyes. Not in distress, not in sleep, just closed as though conserving what little strength remained. I left the room unsettled, with the dawn rising pale and gray outside. Everything was normal. Every test, every vital, every sign of life. And yet, in my chest, I carried the weight of knowing it wasn't, because the longest night of my career was only beginning. By the time the sun rose, the hospital corridors glowed with that strange gray light that seeps through blinds and makes everything look colder than it is. I've always hated dawn shifts. The night carries a kind of honesty with it. People suffer, they cry out, they break, and there's no pretense in it. But daylight in a hospital feels like a lie. Visitors bring in cups of coffee, TVs murmur morning shows, and the air hums with a forced normalcy. Patients still die in daylight, but it feels wrong, like they're breaking some unspoken rule. I tried to tell myself that Thomas would make it through the day, that once cardiology saw him, they'd uncover something subtle I had overlooked. That was the story I built in my head as I made rounds. But underneath, that other voice, the one honed by 20 years in the ER, kept whispering, something is coming. At 9 I checked in again. His wife was awake now, sitting close, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He looked weaker. The color had drained from his face further, lips edged faintly blue, though the monitors betrayed none of it. Pulse steady, oxygen normal, blood pressure acceptable. I leaned over, trying to find some crack in the data. Thomas, do you still feel the heaviness? His lips moved slowly. Not heavy, now it's empty. I frowned, exchanging a glance with the nurse. Empty how? He took a shallow breath. Like something inside moved out. Before I could press further, the nurse interrupted with fresh labs, still clean. The resident beside me muttered, it doesn't make sense. He looks worse, but everything's perfect. I said nothing because there was nothing to say. The hours dragged. Cardiology came. They repeated tests, adjusted leads, even pushed for an echocardiogram to visualize the heart in motion. The images were textbook. No blockages, no clots, no ruptures. They eventually shrugged, chalked it up to atypical chest pain, anxiety perhaps, and began discussing discharge. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt my chest tighten. Discharge was the wrong word. It rang false, like a sentence given too soon. Just before noon, I stopped by his room one more time. The hallway smelled faintly of cafeteria food now, but inside the room the air was different. Still, heavy, almost electric. His wife looked up at me, her expression a plea she didn't have words for. Thomas's eyes were open again, staring at nothing. You're sending me home, he whispered. I nodded carefully. That's the plan, unless something changes. He shook his head faintly. It already has. I felt my stomach turn. What do you mean? But he didn't answer. His gaze drifted back to the ceiling. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the monitor's rhythmic beeping, steady as a metronome. Then I forced myself out, convincing myself I was being pulled into his fear, convincing myself that science, not superstition, runs this place. At 1:30 in the afternoon, I was in the ER again when the page came over the intercom. Code Blue, Observation Wing, Room 12. My heart stopped. That was his room. I ran. You don't think in those moments, you just move. The hallway stretched ahead of me, fluorescent lights blurring past, shoes squeaking on polished tile. When I burst into the room, it was chaos. Nurses at the bedside, the monitor screaming a flat tone, his wife pressed against the wall, sobbing. Thomas was motionless. His skin had gone gray in minutes. I jumped in without hesitation, starting compressions, feeling his ribs yield under my palms with each thrust. The code team swarmed in, airways secured, epinephrine pushed, shocks delivered. His body jolted with the defibrillator, then fell limp again. The room echoed with shouted commands, the hiss of oxygen, the relentless beeping of failure. We fought for 30 minutes in which the human body should give some sign, some flicker on the monitor, some return of pulse, some hint of life. But there was nothing. It was as though he had simply chosen to leave, and the body followed without resistance. Finally, I had to call it. Time of death, 2:07 p.m. The words hung in the air like a sentence I didn't want to deliver. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of his wife's sobs. I pulled off my gloves, my hands shaking, sweat soaking through my scrubs. I looked at the monitor one last time. Flatline. But here's what unsettled me most. The flatline hadn't been gradual. No arrhythmia, no descent into chaos. One moment it had been perfect, steady, rhythmic. The next it was gone, like a switch flipped off. I'd seen hundreds of deaths. I knew the patterns, the spirals downward, the messy collapse of failing organs. This wasn't that. This was absence, sudden, absolute, unexplained. I spoke with his wife afterward, but what could I say? That every test was normal, that by all logic he should have gone home alive. She didn't ask for explanations. She only said through tears, he told me it was waiting. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Later, back in the physician's lounge, I sat staring at the rain-streaked window, replaying every detail. I thought about all the things it could have been. Rare arrhythmias that evade capture, electrical disturbances in the heart, metabolic shifts so fleeting they escape detection. I told myself those stories, clung to them like driftwood. But they all broke apart in my hands. None of them fit. None of them explained the certainty in his voice or the way the monitors had gone from perfect to silence in an instant. And from that moment, the case became something else entirely. Not just a death, but a riddle that medicine refused to solve. After a death in the hospital, the room empties quickly. The code team drifts away one by one, equipment wheeled out, gloves discarded, the monitor silenced. The adrenaline fades, leaving behind a stillness so complete it feels unnatural in a place like this. When I stepped back into Thomas's room after the pronouncement, it was almost too quiet. His wife sat at the edge of the bed, clutching his hand, whispering words I couldn't hear. The rain outside had finally slowed, and in that sudden calm, I realized how loud silence can be. I stayed for a few minutes, long enough to offer condolences, though the words felt hollow. "I'm so sorry. We did everything we could. Doctors say it out of duty. But what I wanted to tell her was different. I wanted to say he knew. I wanted to say I don't understand it either. But those words don't heal, they only wound deeper. So I kept them inside. After she was taken to meet with the chaplain, I walked slowly back through the hall. My colleagues were quieter than usual. One of the residents muttered, "It doesn't make sense," shaking his head as though replaying the code in his mind. Another nurse said softly, "He looked fine all night. How does someone look fine until they're gone?" I had no answers for them. I barely had answers for myself. I went into the physician's lounge and sat down, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor. 20 years in the ER had taught me to compartmentalize. You cry later, if at all. You push it down and move on to the next patient because someone else is always waiting. But with Thomas, I couldn't let go. His face lingered behind my eyes, not in the twisted agony of cardiac arrest, but in the strange calm that preceded it. His stillness, his certainty, his words, "You won't find it." In the hours that followed, I reviewed every result again. I pulled his chart, looked through the scans, reread the labs, checked and rechecked. Nothing, no hidden clue, no subtle marker overlooked. Even the autopsy weeks later would come back inconclusive. Sudden cardiac death of undetermined cause. A phrase that says nothing, explains nothing, and comforts no one. That night, when I finally left the hospital, the storm had passed. The air outside was damp, cool, carrying that washed-clean scent that follows heavy rain. I stood in the parking lot for a long time, staring up at the low clouds drifting apart. It should have felt like relief, but all I felt was emptiness, as though something had been taken from me too. In the days that followed, I kept replaying the timeline. I thought about rare conditions, Brugada syndrome, long QT, ventricular fibrillation that hides until the moment it strikes. I thought about electrolyte imbalances, undetectable arrhythmias, subtle ischemia invisible to scans. Each theory unraveled as quickly as it formed. Science offered possibilities, but none explained the part that haunts me most. The way he knew, not guessed, not feared, but knew. Colleagues tried to comfort me. "Sometimes it happens," one said. "Sometimes the body just fails," another told me. "You did everything right. Nothing would have changed it." Maybe they were correct. Maybe medicine still has blind spots, conditions we haven't named, patterns we can't yet see. But late at night, when the ER quiets and I'm left alone with the hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic, I hear his voice again. It's already here. I began to wonder if patients sometimes perceive things we cannot. If there's an awareness in the final hours that medicine can't quantify. A clock ticking that only they can hear. I've seen it in other ways before. The patient who insists they'll die tonight and does. The elderly man who says goodbye with unusual clarity before slipping away. But with Thomas it was different. His body betrayed nothing. His words were the only sign, and still he was right. The ER went on, of course. It always does. New traumas came in, new crises unfolded. The monitors beeped, the intercom paged codes, lives began and ended. I worked my shifts, sutured wounds, placed lines, cracked chests, resuscitated strangers. But no matter how busy I stayed, I couldn't escape the shadow of that case. Weeks later, I was suturing another patient. Another bar fight, strangely similar to the night Thomas came in. When the memory hit me so sharply I had to pause, needle in hand. For just a second, I heard rain on the ambulance bay doors, smelled the antiseptic mixing with wet asphalt, and saw his eyes staring past me at the ceiling. The sensation was so real that I felt myself shiver under the bright lights. That's when I realized something. In medicine, we are trained to look for patterns, to categorize, to explain. But maybe not everything is meant to be explained. Maybe some cases resist us because they exist at the edge of what medicine can touch. And maybe part of being a doctor isn't solving every mystery, but learning to live with the ones that won't be solved. Still, the questions remain. Did I miss something? Did the machines fail us? Or was he seeing something that I couldn't? Some truth about the end we're not meant to understand? I don't know, I'll never know. But I carry him with me. every time I walk past observation room 12, every time I hear the rain in the ambulance bay, every time a patient looks me in the eye and says something isn't right. It's been years now, and I still think about him. The monitors, the tests, the certainty in his voice, the way his wife said he heard a clock, the way the silence fell when everything should have been fine. The case will always stay with me, not in the way the traumas do, with their blood and violence, nor in the way the tragedies do, with families collapsing under the weight of sudden grief. This one stays quieter, like a shadow in the corner of a well-lit room. No matter how brightly the science shines, I can still see it. The case will always remind me that medicine, for all its triumphs, has borders. We measure blood and pressure, we map electrical currents across the heart, we scan and we probe and we test. But there are places where none of it reaches. Thomas lived and died in one of those places. The case will always haunt me because I never saw it coming. Every number reassured me. Every monitor told me he was safe. I told myself he would go home. I told his wife he was stable. And then in a single instant he was gone. That betrayal cuts deeper than failure. Failure you can trace back to a cause, but betrayal leaves you standing in silence with no explanation. The case will always echo in my mind when another patient says, "I feel something is wrong," even when the tests disagree. I listen harder now. I don't always have an answer, but I give them my time, my eyes, my silence, because sometimes the body knows what machines cannot. The case will always remind me of his words. "You won't find it. He was right. I searched, I questioned, I replayed every possibility, and still I found nothing." Maybe that was his final gift, a kind of truth I didn't want to hear but needed to face. That for all our training, for all our certainty, we don't control the moment the body decides to let go. The case will always make me wonder about that clock his wife mentioned. The ticking he heard. Was it a hallucination born of fear? Or was it something real, something we can't yet measure? An awareness of the end approaching? I've come to believe that dying is not always a sudden event, but a process the mind perceives before the body reveals it. Perhaps he was already listening to something I couldn't hear. The case will always be a shadow in the ER, even when the lights are brightest, even when the hallways are full of noise. I feel it. And when the storms roll in and the rain beats on the ambulance bay doors, I find myself glancing toward room 12, expecting to see him lying there still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The case will always, and I think that's the truest way I can put it, it will always be with me. Not because I failed, not because I made a mistake, but because it revealed something deeper, something unexplainable that medicine could not contain, and that, more than the blood, more than the trauma, more than the chaos of the ER, is what haunts me most.